Wow, this one seemed to come out of absolutely nowhere. After months of rising tensions, the US and India all of a sudden announced this major trade truce. But the details were, well, they were confusing, and the two sides seemed to be telling completely different stories. So let's unpack what's really going on here. So, at the heart of all this are these two numbers. That crippling 50% tariff the US was hitting most Indian goods with has been slashed all the way down to 18%. Now, that's the core of the truce, right? But the story of how we got here and why it happened, well, that's where things get really interesting. And get this, the announcement itself didn't come from some formal press conference. Nope, it came from a post on President Trump's Truth Social account. Now, that term, reciprocal tariff, is basically just a fancy way of saying tit for tat. But the post immediately set the stage for what looks like a classic he said, she said situation. The US version of the deal came with a whole list of conditions, while India's response has been much, much more quiet. It all raises the key question, what did they actually agree to? All right, so to make sense of all of this, here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at the surprise announcement. Then we'll hit rewind and understand the tariff war that got us to this point. After that, we'll try to figure out what's really in the deal, tackle that all-important oil question, and finally, we'll zoom out for the geopolitical bigger picture. Okay, so let's start with the central mystery here. You've got this huge deal announced, the markets seem happy, but when you actually dig into the details that each country has shared, they just don't seem to line up. So that really leaves us with two big questions we've got to answer. First, what are the real terms of disagreement? And second, why now? What was the big rush? To really get why this truce is such a big deal, you have to understand the war that came right before it. This deal didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It's really the climax of a super tense trade dispute that saw tariffs climb to some really punishing levels. And things escalated. Wow, did they escalate fast. I mean, think about it. In early 2025, they're setting this ambitious $500 billion trade target. Fast forward to July, and bam, the US slaps a 25% duty on Indian goods. Then, just 1 month later, they doubled down, adding another 25% penalty tariff. And this one was explicitly tied to India buying Russian oil, bringing the grand total to a staggering 50%. And listen, 50% isn't just a number on a spreadsheet. For a lot of Indian industries, this was a potential knockout blow, especially for sectors like textiles and apparel, where the profit margins are already razor thin. It was absolutely devastating. We're not just talking about higher costs. This was the kind of thing that makes global buyers start looking for new suppliers somewhere else in Asia, and fast. And the impact on the ground was immediate and brutal. A survey from the Confederation of Indian Textile Industry just paints a grim picture. Over 80% of exporters saw their orders just fall off a cliff. Nearly 3/4 were being pressured for huge discounts, and almost half had orders canceled outright. The damage was undeniable. Okay, so that's the backstory. Now, let's get into the deal itself. And this is where we have to be really careful and separate the bold claims from what we actually know for a fact. So on one side, you have the US claims. The announcement said India agreed to stop buying Russian oil, drop its own tariffs to zero, and commit to this massive Buy American plan. But then you look at what's coming out of New Delhi, and it's a very different story. They've really only acknowledged the US tariff cut. On everything else, the oil, the big purchases, it's been radio silence. And that gap right there is where all the confusion is coming from.
And on top of that, it's really important to talk about what's probably not in this deal. Sources in the Indian government are saying that sensitive sectors like agriculture and dairy products are expected to stay protected. And that makes sense. It's been a consistent red line for India in pretty much every trade negotiation, so it would be a huge surprise if that changed here.
All right, let's zoom in on what might be the most controversial, most contentious part of this entire story: the connection between these tariffs and India's oil imports from Russia. Remember this number? That extra 25%? That was the penalty tariff the US tacked on back in August. And it wasn't random. It was explicitly, directly linked to India continuing to buy discounted crude oil from Russia. It was a clear-cut attempt to use trade as a lever to influence foreign policy. According to the White House, the whole deal pretty much hinges on this energy swap. The US wants India to pivot away from Russia and start buying more from America, and maybe even Venezuela. But And this is becoming a recurring theme here. India has not publicly confirmed this at all. Now, while the U.S. pressure is clearly geopolitical, there might also be a purely economic case for this shift. An SBI research report actually calculated that switching from Russian to Venezuelan crude could save India up to $3 billion a year on its fuel bill. So regardless of the politics, the fundamental math might just be changing anyway. So this brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. Why did this truce happen now, after months of things getting worse and worse? Well, the answer seems to lie not in Washington or New Delhi, but maybe in Brussels. The timing here is absolutely critical. Just a week before Trump's announcement, India finalized a huge trade deal with the European Union, and that move basically reset the entire chessboard. No major economy wants to be on the outside looking in while its competitors get special access to a giant, fast-growing market like India. You can bet the EU deal acted as a powerful catalyst, maybe even forcing the US to get back to the table. And the result is a pretty significant competitive shift. This new 18% tariff rate doesn't just give India relief, it actively repositions the country. It puts its goods at a slight advantage over those from regional competitors like Vietnam. And in the high-stakes world of global trade, even a single percentage point can mean the difference between winning and losing a massive order. Ultimately, though, the stakes here are so much higher than just trade. As Kenneth Juster of the Council on Foreign Relations notes, India is an absolutely crucial strategic partner for the U.S. in the Indo-Pacific. A breakdown in trade damages that much broader alliance, which is why this truce was so important for getting the whole relationship back on track.
So, in the end, a truce has been called. It buys some valuable time, and it definitely restores a bit of stability. But it leaves us all with a much bigger question. As this kind of proclamation diplomacy becomes more common, can these sudden, politically driven bargains truly replace the durable, rules-based system that has pretty much governed global trade for decades? That, I think, remains the real test ahead.